Welcome. Let's talk about why your orchid leaves may be turning yellow and what to do about it. We will talk about 6 main reasons. The first 2 are about water, overwatering and underwatering. The best way to tell if you are overwatering or underwatering is to look at your orchid roots. So here's an example. I have this orchid right here that I am growing in a clear pot. If you have a clear plastic pot, then it's really easy to look at your orchid roots. So if I were to see anything that was mushy or brown that was turning black, more of a dark color than a light color, then that can mean that your orchids are overwatered. And the best way to fix that is with your potting mix that is really absorbent and it's not letting the water flush through the potting mix. Then you want to repot with something that's more open, and that would be a bark-based potting mix. On the other hand, if you notice that the roots are kind of a light tan color, then that can mean that it's underwatered. So I have an example right here. So you can see that many of these roots that are coming out of the potting mix do not look very healthy. This one looks pretty healthy right here, but a lot of them don't. And I think we can go directly back to the potting mix here. I'm using these leca clay pellets, and they don't hold very much water. And also this pot that they're potting in has a lot of holes and drainages, which can be good, except for the potting mix doesn't hold very much water. So that's causing these roots right here to die right here. So the best thing for me to do would be to repot this orchid in a new potting mix that has some more water absorbency. So a pot like this obviously has a lot of airflow that can be good. So to compensate for that, I'd want a potting mix that is more absorbent, or I can also repot in something that is a clear plastic pot, and that also holds in more water. And for sure you want to have drainages and even some slits on the side, and that can provide for air movement. But this is just too much for this type of orchid. Too much air, too many holes, too much drainage. And these orchids, the Phalaenopsis, they like to be just barely damp. And you can see that we have some leaves that do not look really happy. We do have a little flower spike that's right here and a new root that's right there. So all is not lost, but this orchid could definitely be improved by at least changing the potting mix to something that's just a little bit more absorbent. Okay, so we've covered overwatering and underwatering. Now let's talk about a nutrient imbalance, and that can be fixed simply with fertilizing, just by feeding your orchid. The best type of fertilizer to use is something that is a complete balanced fertilizer. So a complete fertilizer just means that it has macro and micronutrients, because yellowing leaves can be caused by lack of nitrogen and or magnesium. So if you're not feeding your orchid, then you might want to start doing that. One thing to keep in mind is that orchids really don't need too much fertilizer. So you want to put maybe half to 1/4 strength of what the fertilizer recommends. Fertilize your orchid, put the fertilizer in the water, and then let the fertilized water flow through the potting mix. And then every 4th week, then you'll want to let water just flow through the potting mix and rinse those fertilizer salts away. So I want to show you an example of what too many fertilizer salts can do. So I have this Dendrobium and Nobi, and you can see that some of these leaf tips have started to turn dark brown. So they start out kind of a light brown, and then they get darker and darker. And this orchid in particular seems to be really sensitive to fertilizer salts. So one extra step I can do for an orchid that's really sensitive is to let it soak every once in a while for like 10 minutes or so in distilled water. So it's not something that you want to do regularly, but if you have an orchid that is particularly sensitive to fertilizer salts, that is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is just regularly rinse those salts like we talked about and to dilute the fertilizer. So the first two recommendations have to do with over and under watering. The second two have to do with over and under feeding your orchid. So it's all about getting the right balance. Another thing that can cause yellowing leaves is cold damage. So I want to show you an orchid that's particularly sensitive. And that is this Dendrobium nobile. So right here looks good, and then over here it has dropped leaves. So if this orchid doesn't want temperatures that are below 55 degrees, in fact, as a general rule, if you have warm or intermediate growing orchids for their temperatures, then you don't want anything that is below 55 degrees. So if you have them outdoors and you see that it's going to dip below 55 degrees, then you might want to put on a freeze cloth or to protect it, or bring them inside. And just as a note, if you do have these pseudobulbs right here that don't have any leaves, you don't want to remove them. So you want to keep them on, and when this orchid is in bloom, it really is pretty amazing. It can put out just a real nice profusion of flowers. Along with cold damage, another thing you'll want to watch for is too much light. If an orchid gets too much light, it can bleach out those leaves and they can turn yellow. So this Dendrobium green lantern, you can see that some of these leaves right here, they've received too much light. A couple of ways that you can protect your orchid from too much light is to put up a shade cloth or just a sheer curtain. That's a really simple way, or even move it a bit further away from the window or artificial lights if they're grown with artificial lights, or if it's an outdoor orchid, then you might want to put it where it's a bit more protected from the sun. So just add a little bit of protection. So the second bit of advice is to protect it from too much light and from cold temperatures. Okay, and the last thing to think about is that it is completely natural for older leaves to start to wither and turn yellow and drop off. That's completely normal. So just to review, the first two are about water. Over and under watering can cause yellowing leaves. The second has to do with fertilizer, so you want to protect it from too much or too little fertilizer. And then the last two are environmental factors, and that's too much light or too cold of temperatures. And then lastly, just remember that if you have an orchid that has an old leaf and it's starting to turn yellow, then that's completely okay. So I hope this answers your questions on why your orchid leaves might be turning yellow. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, share it, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.